Okay, so hopefully you were able to get a pretty significant amount of things written in there. Some of the things that we really want to focus in on are the psychosocial aspect. Um, so this is Erickson's psychosocial stages of development. And I'm not going to go through this whole thing. You'll have the PowerPoint. You'll be able to look at it in more detail. But we do want to recognize that when a significant trauma happens, or let's say when chronic trauma starts, there can be some very real, tangible breakdowns in development. And so, if a child who began to experience some type of abuse in early childhood, 2 to 3 years old, is, in the process of figuring out whether or not they can do things on their own, whether or not they can trust themselves. If something begins to happen at that developmental stage, then what we really see often is that when that child gets older, you can see that those developmental needs were not met, and so the mastery over those things never developed. And so when we are treating children, we're never treating their chronological age, we're actually treating their developmental age. And to be quite frank, sometimes you'll have a child who developmentally, emotionally, is maybe 3 to 5 years old. And cognitively, meaning like actual brain structures that are functioning with executive functioning and all of that, might be 6 to 7 years old. So you might have a single child with developmental growths in multiple different domains at different ages. I hope that makes sense. You're always welcome to ask questions in our Canvas discussions if any of this is confusing or if you just want to know more about it. So getting back to this, that means that if you are seeing a child and they're stuck developmentally at 3 to 5 and there's certain masteries that they haven't accomplished in those areas, then that's where we need to go. That's where we need to start. And sometimes it will feel really awkward, or it'll be hard to figure out how exactly to put together treatment that is both culturally appropriate, developmentally appropriate, and then chronologically appropriate, because they also want to be looking at what their friends are doing or what they believe is expected of them. So that's just something to hold, that developmentally there's a lot going on with a child. And beyond physically what is developing in their bodies, there's the emotional part that's developing within them. They're also developing schemas or maps of the world. Dr. Perry talks about maps in one of his early chapters, I think it's Tina's World, where our early experiences, positive or negative, are really what shape the way that we are meant to interact with the world. So how to behave, expectations of us, as well as how to respond to stressors, how to respond to positive interactions. A lot of it we learn specifically from watching our parents or our caregivers, but sometimes we just learn it because that was the natural fight or flight response that came to us at the time, and we did it over and over and over, and so frequent triggers of that, become embedded and also become part of our belief system. So there's part of it that is conscious, but there's also part of it that's unconscious and more instinctual or reactive. Okay. As if development and all of that weren't enough to also hold when we're thinking about vulnerabilities of a child, we also have intersections. So intersections are added factors that could increase the risk of trauma or toxic stress on a child. And I might add that when we think of intersections, depending on what the situation is, a few of these might actually be protective factors. But if we're looking at, so let's say there's a child who has a pretty stable home environment. Well, let's say that that home environment is one factor that makes it really difficult. And then now let's say that that child's race and the way that that child is treated because of their race now makes their school environment really challenging or difficult, or makes them feel like they're inferior in some way, or a child's gender. These are all intersections that could really increase the way that trauma gets stored, as well as the amount of traumatic experiences that a child has throughout their life. So some of the other things we want to make sure that we're looking at is community safety, socioeconomic status, parent or caregiver mental health, and environmental and political climate. There's certain situations in different times of history where a particular political group is in power and so those who don't associate with that group have more incidences of, I don't know, let's say oppression, or of things that just make your general world feel unsafe, or make you as a person feel alienated or isolated. And all of those things contribute to your internal sense of safety. And when we're looking at trauma specifically, that sense of safety is going to be the number one thing that we need in order to find healing or in order to mitigate trauma in the first place. Okay. And so we're also looking at understanding that not all stress is bad, right? A child needs stressors in order to grow and develop. It's a necessity to have a certain amount of stressors. It builds resilience, to be fair. But there's different types of stressors. So you have positive stress, tolerable stress, and then toxic stress. And so positive stressors are usually mild to moderate, they're short term, and there's usually safe or supportive adults around to help you mitigate whatever the impact of that is, or to help you learn how to deal with the stressor, how to deal with the experience, to validate your experience and to provide you with support during that situation. Tolerable stress might be temporary, but allows time for recovery, and there's some supportive relationships. When we get into the situation where it's toxic stress, this is where you find those chronic experiences that really impact the way a child sees themselves and sees the world around them. These are extreme or frequent, and they have extended activation of the body's response. So that's what we're talking about when we get back to how there's that triggered response in your brain that says things are unsafe, things are dangerous, and so those fight or flight hormones get shot down into the rest of your system and have no exit. And so if you have that happen and there's a sense of isolation or being alone or no one else to protect you or to support you, that's when that toxic stress really becomes traumatic. And those experiences and those situations can get stored in that child's mind as a trauma. And trauma memories get stored in a very different way than regular memories. Trauma memories are often very disorganized. They hold lots and lots of information, and it's not really clear to the top or the thinking part of your brain how to organize or how to filter it all out. And so often what happens is a child will have an experience and all these associations built up around that experience. And so one association that's tied to it can trigger a response without anyone on the outside recognizing or even realizing that that child was triggered. And so part of what we want to do with children is to help them figure out what their physiological responses are, so that even if they don't know what the initial trigger is, they can recognize what's happening in their body and then use skills and techniques and tools to be able to regulate through their body and be able to send that message up to their brain that they're safe and that they are able to calm down. Okay. One of the reasons that this is also really important, and how I said they will use those tools and techniques to be able to work with their body and send the message up to their brain, is because the way the brain was developed. And so Dr. Bruce Perry talks about development of the brain, and he says that your brain first develops from the bottom up and then the inside out. So actually, if I were to do this, this would make a lot more sense. So if this were maybe your brain stem, and then this is kind of your limbic area, and we'll get a little bit more into brain functions and parts when we talk about the community resiliency model. But for now, you have this brain stem that is basically initial survival. So this is your automatic systems, your breathing, circulation, digestion, all of that, which is automatic. And then your amygdala, limbic system in here, is storing all the memory. And so all of these memories get stored without pictures and without words. So sometimes they're really hard for your upper brain, which is your prefrontal cortex, to decipher and understand. And so most of the time, an average child, an average adult actually, will have their prefrontal cortex in charge. The executive functioning, that's the part that is in charge of language, is in charge of inhibitions, is in charge of making sure we do the right thing, or recognizing how people are feeling, things like that. And so when this front part, your prefrontal cortex, is the last thing to develop, that means that this internal memory system from your limbic system and your brain stem are the most susceptible to challenges or to wires getting crossed when traumatic experiences happen in childhood. And so most of this part is developed within the first 5 years of a child's life. This last part develops after age 5 and doesn't fully finish developing, I think I said earlier, until age about 25, which means this executive part that is telling us that higher level functioning that says, actually this situation felt really dangerous, but it's not. That part of the brain isn't always fully developed. And so we want to make sure that when we are giving treatments that are for children and that are specifically addressing traumatic experiences that happened in childhood, not just childhood. I think most trauma happens in experiences, gets stored and put into the memory of our body and our muscles and our nervous system anyway. So when you're looking at a trauma treatment, if it's a really good trauma treatment, it has to work with the body. And so that's what I was talking about when we are working bottom up. We are working with the nervous system. We are working with the automatic responses that are happening. And since we can't access the amygdala directly or that limbic system directly, we can access it through our nervous system. So through our sensorial system, through our taste, through our nose, our sight, and our physical ability to touch, or our proprioceptive systems or vestibular. So those are the types of approaches that we really want to take. And when we talk about trauma treatments in a little bit, we'll get into a couple different ways that that happens, or that we can use those tools. So that's it. That's all I have for you right now in thinking through. Oh, just kidding. That's not it. I have one last slide because we always want to talk about resiliency and make sure that we're never forgetting to hunt and hunt and hunt for the resiliency that occurs in each child and each client. And so just because traumatic experiences happen, just because stressful events occur, does not mean that child will automatically become traumatized or that those memories will automatically be stored in a traumatic way. There are multiple protective factors that come into play when a child is developing. And a lot of those factors are here on this graph. But so creating safety is the number one, right? If there's a safe neighborhood or a safe adult, necessarily doesn't even have to be an adult, maybe an older sibling or a cousin that the child feels that they can really rely on or that they are understood by. Those are huge factors. I have so many clients that are able to identify at least one or two people in their life that really, they feed their spirit or they make them feel safe. And that is so valuable to be able to pull from that and to use those relationships to build more resiliency and to build more strengthening factors in that child throughout treatment. Some of the other really important protective factors are obviously early intervention. So just as if a trauma experience happened early in that child's life, having intervention for that trauma experience, the earlier, the better. So studies have shown that children who enter therapy, so if they've had a traumatic experience from the age 0 to 1, or even, when we're looking at traumatic experiences, it doesn't necessarily need to be after birth. There's plenty of situations where still within the womb, significant things can happen that can impact that child's development, either physically or emotionally even. So early intervention can have a big impact on that child's outcomes. Building in safe and responsive relationships. Again, they don't have to be adults, but it's better if they are because there's more safety associated with an adult who can care for you or care for the child. Concrete community support for child and family. I can't stress this one enough. This is, there's so many situations in where I couldn't make any progress with a family or with a child in helping them work through their traumatic experiences, both child and parent usually, without first, meeting those lower level needs of Maslow's hierarchy. If the family doesn't have food, if the family doesn't have secure housing, it's really difficult sometimes to get them to talk about these other things that almost feel ethereal or unimportant because their basic needs are not yet met. So finding those community supports has been really helpful and really important in working with kids and their families. Also noting that I don't think I've ever had a child client who has experienced chronic trauma or high levels of chronic stress who didn't also have caregivers who had a really significant challenging history as well. And a lot of that history getting passed on to the child. And so a lot of the treatment being working with the parents and dealing with their own stuff, and that having significant positive impacts in their child's treatment. Building in social emotional competence, so that child understanding themselves, becoming aware of themselves and their emotional experience, as well as their caregivers, having a social emotional competence of how important it is for them to understand and be able to express emotions and understand and be able to express what's going on with them physically. It has really great benefits as well. And then parental resilience, going back to that understanding that most traumatic experiences that happen with kids have also happened with their parents or caregivers, and sometimes their caregivers have experienced extremely worse things. And so finding those resiliency factors in the parents has been really incredible, especially in helping them to realize how they've built their own resilience and then how they can support their children in building that resilience. And then sometimes if parents aren't available or aren't engaged, then teachers or then community members, or anybody who's willing to show up for that kid. But getting as many people to provide positive experiences and secure attachments for that child has been really, really valuable. Okay, so that's all I have for you now. Next video, we'll go over some trauma treatments. Okay, thank you.